This morning we'll be we'll be in Genesis, and I'll read from chapter 16. I gave you the wrong chapters. It's 16 and 21, not 22. But I want to share with you about Hagar, the forgotten mom. And the reason I titled it that way is when it comes to women in the Bible and mothers in the Bible, we readily think of Mary and we think of Sarah and perhaps think of Hannah, but whoever thinks of Hagar. And I think that even though she's not mentioned much in the Bible, I think that there are some things that we can learn from her. So in chapter 16, I'm going to read the whole thing. It's a little long, but not too bad. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave you my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do with her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and Hagar fled. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly I have seen him who looks after me." During the time of Abram, if a wife could not conceive and bear a child, then she became stigmatized by society, and people looked upon her as cursed by God. If she were a woman of means and owned a slave, she could offer that slave to her husband to be a surrogate mother to produce children. Sarai, tired of the stigma, tired of waiting on God to answer her prayer, driven by her desperation to find fulfillment and vindication, takes this step and offers her slave Hagar to Abraham. Well, as what usually happens when things go awry, when we take matters into our own hands and we try to help God out. Hagar became pregnant. Sarai is filled with a jealous rage and becomes abusive in her treatment of Hagar. And Hagar, sick of the abuse, runs away and heads back to Egypt. It's kind of interesting to me that she made that choice. We don't know the circumstances, but someone in Egypt had to have sold her to Abram and Sarai to begin with. And she was probably a young girl, maybe probably between the ages of 8 and 12. Sometimes parents would sell children into slavery and use the money to pay off a debt that they otherwise could not pay. Perhaps she was one of the gifts that Pharaoh gave to Abram and Sarai in Genesis 12. So Hagar goes back to a situation where really there's nothing for her. But it's familiar, and it looks better than her present situation, so she goes. And you know, you and I tend to do that ourselves. We lean toward what's familiar, even if it's not perhaps the best thing for us. And on the way back home, she comes face to face with God. More than 50 times, Jesus appears in the Old Testament, and it is what scholars call a Christophany. And Jesus is referred to in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord. He often assumes the shape and appearance of a man, but he has not yet become a human being. That happens at Christmas down the road. Now, Hagar isn't perfect. She's flawed. She has problems with arrogance and ambition. She's disrespectful. She has an attitude that invites trouble. However, there are things that develop as a result of her encounter with God that I think are worth noting. And if you're taking notes, the first thing I would share with you is her faith. Her faith. What was Hagar? She was Egyptian. What was her religion? Polytheism, the worship of many gods. But after 10 years of being with Abraham and Sarai, being with this family, she has come to learn that there is one true God, and she is able to recognize him and calls him the God who sees me. And her faith goes deeper than just a very dramatic, emotional, spiritual, religious encounter. Jesus tells her to go back to the place of misery and submit to Sarai. And Hagar returns. And she's able to do that because of God's presence, his promise, and his purpose. God's presence. She knew that God was aware of her situation. And she knew that even though she was going back to this place of misery, this place of suffering, she knew that God would continue to watch over her. She had a promise. The promise that the son that she carried would be a great nation. And the descendants of her son Ishmael make up about 25% of the world's present population. And as for God's purpose, well, Ishmael was the Bible's first redneck. He's called a donkey of a man, stubborn, willful, hard-headed, difficult to get along with. But God was going to bless this boy. And I think there's some things for us to learn here with this. First of all, wherever you are in your life, don't give in to despair. Life is hard, but God will use those difficult times to take us and form us and shape us into the image of his Son as he carries out his plan for our lives. Understand, he sees you. He sees you where you are. And he is with you. And you and I this morning have promises that can be counted on. I shared with you before, a couple of months ago, a verse that's become very important to me in my life is Psalm 119:71. It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. And if God has given you a son or a daughter that's like Ishmael, you know, we see our kids as they are. And sometimes we go, oh my. But God sees them for what they will be. And if God can take a wild donkey like Ishmael and make him a great nation, then he has a plan for your child as well. Submit to his process, even when it's difficult. Trust him with your future. And not only your future, but the future of your child, regardless of how old they may be. Have faith in the true and living God who sees you and hears you. The second thing that I see here is her situation, and that's in Genesis chapter 21. I won't read it, it was specifically verses 8 through 21. Hagar goes back, and God watches over her. And she and Ishmael lived there for 14 years in relative peace. Everybody seems to be getting along. Life is progressing like it should. And then he's born, Isaac. And Ishmael's inheritance gets cut from 100% to just a third of his dad's estate. And Sarah's on the warpath again. Now earlier when Hagar left, she left on her own terms. She headed for home, along the road where she would have access to food and water and have her needs supplied. But this time she's forced out into the desert, out in the middle of nowhere, with just a couple of days of water. No possibility of meeting her own needs, no chance for survival. She and Ishmael were sent out to die. Without hope, overcome by grief and despair, everything taken from them, they make a desperate cry out to God. And in Genesis 21, look at verse 17. God heard Ishmael, and he answered. And how did God answer? Did he rebuke them by saying, "Come on, where's your faith?" Did he answer with scorn? "What's the matter with you? What do you want now?" Did he reject them? No, not at all. And the reason I spend a moment here is because when our faith falters, when we don't trust like we know that we should, and we start to give in to despair and become overwhelmed by our circumstances, we do a pretty good job of beating ourselves up. Don't do that. Wherever you are in your life, no matter how strong or weak your faith may be, no matter how confidently you stand or if you're bent over or being crushed by your burden, cry out to God. He's not going to treat you with scorn, and he's not going to rebuke or reject you. Now look again at verse 17. How did God respond? He responded with concern and assurance. And look at verse 19. God opened their eyes and he met their need. You know, it's hard to see God when life as you know it comes to an end. But if you will just do what Hagar and Ishmael did, cry out to God. He sees where you are. He hears your voice. And he will open your eyes to see his provision, and he will meet your need. In closing this morning, there's one more thing that I wish to point out. Please look at verse 20. From this miracle of deliverance, Hagar and Ishmael still faced an uncertain future. But God was with Ishmael, and his promise and plan for Hagar's son were fulfilled. You and I continue to live in uncertain times because we do not know, we simply cannot know what tomorrow brings. But trust God with your children. Place them in his hands. Especially if your son or daughter is acting like a wild donkey. He sees them. He loves them. And he will work in their lives to bring his plan for them to completion. Trust him. Happy Mother's Day.